audience, we shall now be moving on to a very interesting subject, a very pertinent topic of discussion today, and that is how is the SI ecosystem working with customers in implementing SRE? Now, we have always seen customers engage with system integrators to provide the services to run IT related activities. Any system integrator who provides managed services finds SRE a new thing to fit into their system as they do not have end to end responsibility and the autonomy to make vital decisions. Our upcoming discussion with our panelists attempts to take a holistic approach on making the system integrators look from the customer's point of view in creating value delivery. Without any delay, let's get the ball rolling and invite our panelists onto the stage to share their experiences and thoughts on this mind-boggling topic. First, we have Mr. Steve Ng, Developer Relations Lead at New Relic, as a panelist, joined by Mr. Naresh Chaudhary, Vice President at Infosys. Lastly, we have with us Mr. Harpreet Singh, co-founder and CTO at Watermelon Software Inc. Moderating this session is Dr. Niladri Chaudhary, founder and CEO at Excellentro Consulting Services. With that, let's give a thunderous round of applause to our lovely panelists and moderator for this session. I now hand over the mic to Dr. Niladri to take it forward. Over to you, sir.
Hello, everyone. This is Niladri Chaudhary, CEO of Excellentro India and Singapore, and the chief organizer for the DevOps India Summit, the largest summit from Asia. Today in the panel, we have with me Naresh Chaudhary from Infosys, Steve Ng from New Relic, Mandeep Ubhi, and we have Harpreet Singh from Watermelon.ai, and Garima Bajpayee from Capital Carbon Consulting. So let us start off with today's topic. And the first question that I would ask everybody one by one is, to you, what is SRE? And I will start with Naresh.
Sure. So Niladri, I mean, for me, right, it is just another sort of, way of looking at DevSecOps. And my definition comes from my own practical experiences of actually going through the 9 years in terms of, starting early on within the organization, looking at whole movement from waterfall to agile and then DevSecOps and eventually where we are with respect to SRE. So for me, frankly, it is just an element of taking the whole DevSecOps journey ahead. So in my view, right, it is about looking at SRE in the form of the next step for DevSecOps. So that's the way I would look at it. And in some ways, right, it sort of incorporates aspects of software engineering that we are applying into infrastructure, operations, etc. And with an intent of looking at creating highly scalable, highly reliable systems. In a very brief, right, that's what SRE is all about.
I will go with this question to everyone because that's the starting point. So next, I'll ask Steve to give me his idea of SRE.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Thank you so much. I think the definition of SRE for us, especially for us here in New Relic, is predominantly focused on uptime and reliability. The reason is because for us, our platform, we are a cloud-based observability platform. When customers sign up to us, reliability of the platform is literally the trust that we promise to our customers right there. So for us, it's pretty much an evolution, what you've seen with operations engineer, where SRE predominantly focus on uptime, reliability, is responsible in making sure all product teams, like all the products that we offer, they all embed SRE principle as part of their development life cycle there.
Thanks, Steve. So let me go to Mandeep.
Yeah. So to me, SRE is something that actually ties technology with the business value, right? So we have been talking about agile DevOps, And where Agile and DevOps basically end, they end at number of deployments, faster time to market, to be able to do more production deployments, and then the story ends there. But with SRE, the story continues from that point on. Once the deliverable, once the product is in production, once the customers are actually using it, what happens then? The day-to-day issues. So, as an analogy, I was thinking about, we all, watch movies. So the movies end with a happy ending, right? And then we all see, and the things worked on from that point on, and everybody lived happily ever after. But nobody talks about the day-to-day issues after that. So to me, Agile and DevOps end with that movie. They're like that movie, faster number of, more number of deployments, faster time to market, and the story ends. Everybody's happy. But then what happens after that? What happens on day 2? What happens on day 3? What happens on day 4? The day-to-day issues, the systems went down, production is kind of slow, customers are not able to access the platform or the application, uptime and reliability is kind of suffering. What comes to help? Agile, DevOps, or SRE, right? So Agile and DevOps could be debatable there. What comes to help at that point in time? But SRE definitely is there to help. So that's what SRE is to me. It's just kind of taking the story forward onto day-to-day issues while running the production systems.
Thanks, Mandeep. So let's go to Harpreet.
Yeah, hi. Good day, everybody. SRE as a practice, to me, in very simple terms, is an enabler to achieve organizational outcomes. Now, if you look at what any organization wants, they want superior customer experience. They want to have faster time to market. They need to have reliable and stable systems, and they need to have efficiency in their processes, in terms of cost, in terms of scale, right? So SRE actually, we've got to look beyond SRE from a people function to a practice. And as a SRE as a practice, if done holistically, actually helps organizations achieve some serious outcomes and goals that they want to achieve, right? I would echo Mandeep to a great extent where he said that, your DevOps and all that can take you to a certain point, but what happens, in day-to-day life, right? When, systems are going down and so on. So obviously you want to have a time to market, but you also don't want to compromise on stability, right? So it's always a battle between velocity and stability, right? So that's on the right side of development. However, if you look at on the left side, SRE actually plays a very pivotal role in ensuring that the reliability shifts left and actually moves efficiently to the right. I think in simple terms, that's my view on SRE.
Thanks, Harpreet. And now I'll go to Garima.
Thank you, Aniladri, and great points and great question. So for me, SRE would be the ops centricity in DevOps. So when we talk about SRE, it's obviously 4 components which we are talking about. How to make your DevOps data driven through matrices and SLOs, and budget policies, and all the other kind of related parameters or aspects or characteristics of SRE practice. The second part of this would be reliability. Definitely, SRE takes a bigger role. When we talk about DevOps market would reach 6 billion by 2023. So what happens to reliability? It's not all about innovation. It is also about scalability, reliability, and how you ensure that you build trust. The third aspect would be, how do you bring emerging technologies into DevOps context? How do you make it observable? How observable your system, your pipelines would be, and how can you experiment and trust these emerging technology integrations with your DevOps, ecosystem? And fourth and most essential, I think Harpreet mentioned it in some context. SRE actually leads the way to green software movement. And I would emphasize this fact because with cloud, resources are becoming surplus. And it is not okay to have that notion. So how do you make your resources optimal? How do you make that ecosystem of technology more green? 13% of your carbon footprint management today is accounted by ICT technologies. So SRE practices are very vital to make our DevOps ecosystem more conscious about your carbon footprint, your resource optimization, cost management, and a lot more. So I think with these 4 points, this is how I see SRE and the ops centricity into the DevOps movement.
Thanks, Garima. Good points that I hear. And taking this definitions that you have mentioned, I'm sure that multiple organizations are implementing SRE in different ways. I would not try to say what is right or wrong, but I would like to understand from you, in your experience of working with various organizations, what do you see as how SRE is being currently implemented in different organizations? And to start with, I will go with Steve because he's coming from a vendor scenario. So he is working with multiple organizations of different shapes and sizes and different domains. So, what is your view on that?
I don't have a magic answer for you. The reality is, I do work with quite a lot of customers when they first implemented SRE, and a lot of customers, believe it or not, when they first implemented SRE, it's merely a title change. The process, the thinking, everything that's needed behind it, that really comes later. I think Google did a really good job when they first, what I call open source and tell the whole world how they run some of the best operations team in the world. They started writing this handbook and they start sharing this concept. A lot of people really liked the idea and they straight away took it, but not really understanding what's the maturity of your team first. A great example, even for us, we actually don't follow exactly what Google SRE describes in their handbook, where they traditionally take software engineers and get them to take on ops responsibility. Ours is the other way around, is what I call ops engineer, taking on more software engineering principles and responsibly what we do on the other side. So it's actually the other way around. So usually when I actually speak how people actually implement SRE, predominantly just they do a title change, but they haven't really fixed the fundamentals. Means haven't really changed the process, the way how they triage issue from the past. And from there, usually based on that, and we slowly kind of work with customers and decide, hey, maybe we work usually people and process first before the technology or any tooling will come into play.
Thanks, Steve. Let me hear the others. So now going to Naresh.
Yeah, Niladri. So, I'll give you two perspectives. One is internal to Infosys, right? How have we evolved some of this? And second is what we are observing with partners, customers that I typically come across. So, frankly, within the company, we have a mixed bag in terms of having some sort of advisory, in specialized skill sets, etc., around SRE. And the involvement there at times is not completely hands-on, right? So it's more of sharing knowledge, advising from the outside. The ownership is still with the respective teams, and then from there we have sort of moved to now having some amount of these capabilities embedded within the teams. So to a good extent, this is where we are within the organization. With customers, partners, I have seen a mix of things. Some cases, exactly what I explained, that's happening within our company, which is sort of some part we have embedded these skills within the delivery teams. But I've also seen fairly mature setups where in some customers, there is full ownership in terms of services, infra, sometimes good portions of the app as well. And, the SRE team sort of own a good section of this, right? Some customers and partners where SREs own the overall deployment and the respective tooling around it, and then sort of in some ways manage the production environments to a great extent. So those kinds of things, right? So again, what I've seen from experience is it starts with sort of advisory and things like that, and as teams start to see value, you start to then bring in aspects of embedding some of these skills into the delivery teams, into the product teams, and that's how it's evolved for us. That's what we typically see it at customer places also, and I think that's also perhaps the right way to go, because otherwise you fall into the trap of just having nomenclature and role changes, right? But on the ground the practices etc don't, and then the outcomes really don't start to change.
Sure. So now I'll come to Mandeep, having experience of both in-house and now with multiple clients.
Yeah. So interesting journey so far. And yeah, I think interesting is an understatement. It all starts with the internal experience that I had. So starting from the strategy discussions, building out a strategy for, let's say, next 4 to 5 years. And it's not just about one team or two teams or three teams or one business unit. We're talking about the entire infra portfolio. We're talking about the entire organization. So looking at different aspects, from the strategy perspective, which teams are on cloud yet, which teams are on still on the internal, data centers or on-prem kind of workloads, and then looking at, if once we start on this journey, how are we going to measure the success of it? How are we going to evaluate the outcome of this? Before we actually start the journey, right? So we know that teams for the services that they're maintaining, they need to have SLIs, they need to have SLOs, they need to have some sort of dashboards implemented. But what is the business outcome? What is the actual value that is coming out of from those green, red, rag kind of dashboards? What is the value that is coming out of from by defining those SLOs in the first place? How are we going to use those SLOs in the first place, and how those SLOs align with the organization's OKRs, for example? Those kind of strategic discussions, and then going, cascading that strategy down to the ground level, thinking, okay, so this is the top level strategy that we have, how it applies to your teams, how it applies to your portfolio, how it applies to your team, where you can start, what you can do, given this high level strategy, what is that you can start with, right? So going the contextual implementation, not just kind of giving a blanket statement, do this by end of Q3 or Q4, but going by contextual implementation. Okay, so what is relevant for your team? What is relevant for your portfolio? Do that, start there. That's one. Coming to the clients, it varies a lot. So some of the clients have already started in bits and pieces. So they know what SLI is, they know what SLO is, they have implemented some SLOs. But then after a few months down the line, they can't make sense of it. So they know that teams have SLOs implemented. But when they have to basically go and talk to the business, to go and talk to the leadership, what values these SLOs are bringing to the table, how are they solving the problem? What is the business problem that these SLOs are solving in the first place? It's a blank, right? So again, so these are the kind of things that I've been observing for a while now, and I think my take on how do we implement SRE? It has to be strategy driven. So I think in my experience, that approach has worked the best so far. So starting from the top and then taking the strategic discussions to the team level and doing the contextual implementation based on that strategy. So that's what my take is.
Thanks, Mandeep. Harpreet?
Yeah, I think I can speak for an hour on this. Having been one of the champions in establishing the SRE practice in DBS in my previous role, so I'll kind of talk a little more about that, right? So this is kind of distilling my 4-year journey in like the next 2 to 3 minutes. Now, see, it's very simple, right? When we started off, we were also overawed by looking at what Google did, and we tried to understand and make sense of it. Now, to be honest, what works for Google, right? It's great because what we see is what's been published, right? But what we don't see is all the hard yards they put in right at the start of their journey, which is actually not very visible and not very evident, right? So SRE, in its sense, is to each its own, right? And we kind of looked SRE not really as, again, I'll repeat myself, right? We did not look at it as a people function. We looked at it as a practice, right? Because you could get any number of people to be SREs, but if your practices are not right, your people can't do magic every day, right? Nobody has a magic wand. So you really got to work that out. And the earlier you do it, the better, right? So yeah, you definitely need some support at the top. You've got to, take some baby steps. Like, for example, back in 2018, when we started, we looked at two things. And see, the challenge with enterprises is most of them are brownfield. they've got hundreds and thousands of applications running. So how do you actually inject new practice into it, right? And while people talk about DevOps, DevSecOps, I mean, what's the maturity level organizations are at today, right? And again, that is questionable as well in many cases. And now, if you want to take it to the next level and bring in something like an SRE in there, and as Steve mentioned, right, the easiest thing is just change titles and live with the false sense of glory that we've implemented SRE, but you're going to get nothing out of it, right? Your people are still going to do the same thing every day. Nothing on the ground changes, and so on. So start small, right? So we did look at chaos testing and observability to start off with, and I think, see, again, a lot of people are influenced by the Google strategy, right? Do SLOs, SLIs. Yeah, absolutely great metrics to have. But you've actually got to start looking beyond that. Are you having incidents due to design? Are you having incidents due to code quality? Are you having incidents due to testing? What's your mean time between failures? So there are a lot more metrics that, actually start to drive your reliability. SLO is a good measure of, customer experience and tech and business alignment and all that, right? But what's on the ground is actually a different story altogether, right? So, again, I'll echo what Mandeep said, right? You've got to look at metrics, you've got to look at strategy and all of that. Now, the second key thing is, what kind of operating model do you build for an organization, right? Now, you can imagine an organization which has 10,000, 15,000 people, and SRE is a journey, and you can't transform that many number of people or inject practices, overnight. So what's that operating model going to be? So are you going to create a central function and then have, satellite SRE teams? Whereas the central function looks at strategy, looks at product enablement, looks at tech transformation, looks at people enablement, and so on, right? So how do you actually create a program around that? And then how do you actually start to drive that transformation, either grounds up, or, you could even go top down. So that's on your brownfield. But what happens to your greenfield, right? So now you've got to have that SRE first mentality as well. So how do you bake in those practices, saying that, if I need to have reliability, I can have the best engineers in the world, but if I've got crappy architecture, how am I going to get reliability? If I've got poor capacity planning practices and I'm sizing my systems based on gut feel, how am I going to get reliability? So all these practices need to come in, right? And then the central function, plays a pivotal role in establishing those practices, and that gets channeled down. And over time, you'll actually realize that you can achieve a higher developer to SRE ratio in a very meaningful and a measurable way, right? And obviously, that SRE first mindset is crucial. I know, Niladri, you personally have been doing yeoman service to the world, imparting the SRE knowledge, and that is phenomenal, right? Because culture is what makes or breaks an organization and a transformation in a way. And, that people element is very vital. And lastly, be metrics driven, right? How are you baselining yourself? How are you measuring yourself forward? Are you looking at change to incident ratio? Are you looking at mean time between failures? Look beyond, SLOs and SLIs. So there's a lot more to it. But of course, there's no secret sauce or there's no magic recipe, right, that it could work for everybody. So, you've got to look at every organization, the dynamics, the management, the organization structure, and cater to what works best. But again, don't boil the ocean. Take some baby steps, show some initial success, and you'll actually realize that people join the bandwagon very quickly. And that really helps you to take it to greater heights over time. Sorry, I said 2 minutes and I spoke 5 minutes. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Arpin. So let's ask Garima the same question.
Thank you, Niladri. And I think a lot has been already said. And I'll actually differentiate the SRE practice in 3 parts. The first part would obviously be like mature organizations, where you see that there are thousands of people, working on separate business units. And what from my experience is that there are localized pockets of SRE, implementations done in silos. That's where it starts. But as Harpreet and Mandeep mentioned, that there can be an approach where you can bring center of excellence and then satellite teams, but also focus on the outcome. SRE practice cannot be an initiative to cut the long tail of non-performing businesses. So that should be very, very clear. So there is one way to approach this is you can segregate business units or business zones. and start to kind of implement SRE practices from those kind of center of excellence. So that's for mature organizations. But when you talk about new upcoming emerging businesses, they have a different need altogether. So they need express services. They need to ensure that they have services which can modernize them. They can integrate emerging technologies as quick as possible. So there is another kind of approach required for those kind of businesses, small and medium. Why they should care about bringing DevOps engineers and SREs and other roles. Like they think from my experience, they actually believe that all can be done by a bunch of people who are cross-functional. So there's another separate approach to this. And the third segment, I would say, is highly secure and reliable businesses where, let's say critical infrastructure, organizations which are providing critical infrastructure. For that, SRE is definitely a very, very different profile altogether, because it has to have strict SLOs. It has to work in a very, very different manner altogether. So these are three segments, and everybody mentioned there is no secret sauce. There is you have to do an assessment. You have to bring more experience and expertise from various domains to ensure that we work together towards the business outcome which these organizations are needing to have through SRE practice.
Thanks, Garima. So, one of the points which I see everybody talking about is reliability. And on the one side, we are talking about reliability. On the other side, we also know that a very small percentage of work is done by any organization by itself in our current scenario. There's a lot of code coming from different sources, open source, and other areas, which necessarily means that there is possibility of not having that reliability everywhere. And from that point of view, when you are looking at code coming from different sources, when you are looking at multiple service providers providing different services to the same organization in the same value stream or product team, if you call it. Now, from that point of view, how do you implement SRE? How do you make sure that you still achieve the kind of reliability that we are talking about? And this time I'll start with Mandeep.
I love that question. I've been into so many, I would say, deep into these kind of situations where the multiple vendors, not even vendors, you talked about source coming from multiple sources, which is so very true, especially with the large organizations, because large organizations have become large by acquisitions, right? So they have acquired other smaller companies over the years. So what has happened as an outcome of that at this point, these large organizations, and no names really, but these large organizations have pockets of applications, right? And these applications are coming from the companies that they have acquired over time. So what has happened that there's a hierarchy of people and hierarchy of teams, but then there is a hierarchy of applications now. So we have upstream applications, we have downstream applications, and then there are other application teams that are enabling the communication between upstream application and downstream applications. And these applications are not doing anything from the business perspective. They're just enabling communication between these hierarchy of applications. And so much so happens, I mean, in terms of the application landscape, right? There's so much of complexity. And if you try to implement some of the metrics or some of the reliability practices for one application, you can't really make sense unless you have connected rest of the hops, okay, rest of the integration points. And we all know the integration points is where the problems are most of the times. And teams know what their applications are doing, but they don't know how it is integrated with other applications, and nobody has basically accountability and ownership of that integration point. Standardization is the name of the game. Okay, so I'll just conclude it that way. Standardization is the name of the game. If you see these problems are being addressed at the industry level, if you talk about open telemetry, open SLO, platforms like Cortex, what these are doing, they are just bringing standardization to multiple vendors, multiple applications. So and then things like time series databases, right? So every application can expose time series database that is a standardized format. And then there are platforms that can read the time series database and then can put it out somewhere. And then we can build our complex SLOs, looking at all the applications, not just one applications, by scraping the metrics from that centralized place. So because every application is kind of sending the data in a standardized format, which is time series, for example, it's not the only one, but I'm just kind of taking an example. So what I'm trying to tell you, from this perspective is standardization is really, really required. We can't really fix everything. We can't really fix all the legacy that has been built over decades. Or almost every organization has a baggage. We can't really cut that baggage off and say, move forward. We can't really do that. Some of the applications, critical applications, are running on mainframe systems, as you know. So we can't really fix all of that. What we can do is we can bring some sort of standardization into what SRE really needs. And what SRE really needs is, to implement observability, we need alerts, we need logs, we need metrics. And if we can put some sort of standardization into these tactical artifacts that we need, I think that can actually solve this problem to a great extent. So open SLO, open telemetry, these are the futuristic, I would say, platforms going forward.
Thanks, Mandeep. So with the same question to Harpreet.
Yeah, so this is actually really a very good question, right? And I can again speak with experience. What you'll realize over time, as you continue to implement SRE practices and principles within your organization, over time you'll actually see a dip in incidents due to internal factors, and you'll actually see potentially increase due to external factors, right? And actually, it becomes very, very challenging to obviously manage things where you don't really have control. Now, if you have the privilege or luxury of getting your source code, if you kind of getting your development done through a managed source, I think that's still manageable, because you can enforce your standards, you can enforce your code quality gates, you can enforce the way you want to test. And again, going back to what Mandeep said, you can standardize certain practices, because at the end of the day, it all has to be principle driven, right? You've got to have those fundamental principles, and you can't vary from those principles, right? So if somebody's shipping you code, make sure you go through your proper vulnerability scans, your code quality scans, your open source compliance, and so on. Right? So you can do that. And again, you can dictate certain methodologies that work for you. Ensure you have the right testing practices, you have the right metrics to measure and build that confidence before you can push something into production. I think that becomes very, very crucial, because where you don't really have control, then you've got to do data, then you've got to let data do the talking. So how do you actually bring in data-driven practices to be able to build that confidence in the delivery that you have from say a vendor before you turn that into production? So I think that becomes very, very crucial. On the other hand, again, speaking with experience, there was a time when we did chaos testing on critical products, and we kind of started this philosophy of doing chaos testing on the left side. Do it in UAT. Don't necessarily need to do in production, because a lot of organizations can't do it. So if you can bring in certain practices such as this, you can start to break vendor products where you have very little dependency, right? Again, through experience, I can share that back in 2018, we kind of broke a certain product, and we actually found design flaws in that vendor product, right? They had a single path of failure. The web server could not connect to two app servers. So, it could connect only to one web server, had a mapping it was a one-to-one mapping with an app server. So if you lose your app server, basically you have a single path of failure, right? Now, these are things that we actually, very proudly fed back to the vendor, saying that you've got to fix this, right? Now, it's better to bring certain things to light rather than, getting hit in production. So again, standardization is one. Second thing is try to get your vendors onboarded to your standards in terms of code quality, testing practices, and so on. Invest a little bit in things like chaos testing, for example, where you probably build a lot more confidence before shipping something over, right? I think these are a few tips and tricks that you could do. Again, one more thing I'd probably add is where you're reliant on a totally third party, where you don't really have a code, but say you're reliant on a CDN, for example, right? How do you influence them? But there you've got to influence yourself through design. You should maybe potentially have a bypass feature. What happens if your CDN is out? You should be able to, swing across. So, so then there's a lot of influence driven through design on achieving some of the reliability goals that you might have in production. So again, it's horses for courses, right? So you've got to look at, what is that vendor providing to you, whether there's something that can fit your standard, fit within your scheme of things, align to your principles. But if it can't, then you've got to innovate to be able to preempt what could go wrong and fix that ahead of time, right? Again, these are through some real life experiences that I'm sharing, right? So I've kind of seen this happen in the last 3 to 4 years.
Thanks, Harpreet. So coming to Garima, the question is that we heard Mandeep, we heard Harpreet talking about standardization, talking about bringing in some amount of observability, doing chaos to find defects much earlier, looking at fixing things by refactoring, first identifying and then refactoring the technical dates, maybe re-architecting. Now, how do you bring in these things in the 3 parameters that you talked about, keeping in mind that you are working with multiple vendors around?
My standard answer, and I'll give a bold response to this. Marketplace for SRE tools and platforms looks very exciting, intriguing. Sometimes it's so exciting that people want to jump on the bandwagon and invest in SRE tools and platform just to showcase that how good they are in approaching emerging technology and trends. But my bold view on this is that if you are heading towards a change, a shift, a transformation, adopting a new practice, and through my own experience, don't buy a product first. Buy a service, because that would make more sense to do an assessment of why do you need SRE practice for these different business zones or enterprise zones. What is the economic or the cost structure which you're looking for? What kind of competence would be needed? There is an array of competence which will be required. So do you need them all? How do you tackle that competence gap? And lastly, I would say that risk. What is your risk appetite? It's good to talk about observability, chaos engineering, new platforms and tools for SLOs and matrices and dashboards. But what is that risk appetite of an organization? Are you starting to experiment with new capabilities like chaos engineering? Do you want a larger framework for chaos engineering? Is that the need? So I think my bold approach towards this would be that do start with a service. If there is a marketplace for SRE platforms and tools, please create a marketplace for SRE services. So that's my take on it.
Thanks, Garima. We'll see what we can dig in more on the SRE service marketplace. But going to Steve, my question would be that when you are looking at observability and when we are looking at multi-vendor scenario, when we are looking at products coming from various sources, how can an organization tackle those kind of scenario in a extended, I would call it a extended observability? And as Harpreet mentioned earlier, that we have to look at it not only from the production point of view, but the entire life cycle. And in the life cycle, we have different sources. So how do you see, first of all, people doing it? What do you think observability through tools like yours can help in throwing out those kind of situations which we need to attack much early in the day? As we know today that the whole pipeline, the CI/CD pipeline, has extended to production. But have we shifted left to extend observability into the entire pipeline and not look at it only from the endpoint view?
Yeah, that's a great question. Quite often, when I often speak to customers, I often say tooling is not your solution. You shouldn't buy a tool first. I really like the idea of standardization because our engineers always like to challenge that standard again and again. And chaos engineering is something that we also do too internally right there. So usually what I do is I kind of even just throw away the concept of observability because it's quite an advanced concept, right? I just ask, how do you fix issue today? What do you do? And you just walk me through that process right there. Observability is just what I call a practice or really a philosophy where you kind of put in more reliability practice and influence in the architecture decision that you do. So, for example, software engineers traditionally just build software. They push feature out and they kind of mark the ticket and they're done and they move on to the next feature. But now with observability practice, a developer just have to be mindful when they build code. They also be mindful of reliability practice, but also making sure they expose the right telemetry, the right contextual metadata out to the right people. That's all. Once this is done right, then observability practice can come in. Once this is done right, then tooling can come into play and much, much more on that part right there.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. So I'll look at Naresh on the point that how do you bring in that end-to-end standardization and standardization even in terms of observability to look for that one single objective of reliability being the first class citizen.
Yeah, no, great question, Niladri. So Niladri, for us, right? I mean, frankly, it was sort of starting with looking at which apps and what matrices, right? And why do you need those kind of matrices for those applications? I think it's started with something like that. And what we soon found is, the market really doesn't have everything that you need. And to the point that Steve and Garima both made, right? Uh, I don't think even if one was to go to a marketplace of sorts and pick up stuff, right? I don't think there is enough stuff out there for somebody to actually do this at scale, right? So I sort of divide this into three levels of maturity. One is sort of the initial level where you have a whole lot of manual stuff happening with minimal monitoring and at times fairly unclear reliability goals, right? Uh, People have opinions, right? So you have unclear reliability goals, and then you move to a slightly reactive approach, and then go to a more proactive approach where you have a whole lot of automation in place, right? A lot of the monitoring is proactively done, toil identification, etc., is happening. The reliability objectives are done through very defined SLOs and things like that, right? You have observability, which is fairly advanced at that stage, and then for you to scale this, you again need something better. So you are looking at insights, intelligent monitoring. You are looking at continuous reliability. You are looking at integrated DevSecOps that is working in a completely seamless manner. All of your chaos engineering experiments and validations are working at scale, right? So for us, frankly, it meant creating some of our own platforms, right? We had to do it with DevSecOps almost a decade ago. We had to do something with SRE again a few years ago. We had to create our own platform to be able to accomplish some of this. And again, the ideas were very similar to what the rest of the panel has spoken. Can we standardize? Can we bring everybody on the same page? And with live engineering, can we make sure that different personas are looking at metrics with the similar objectives, right? Because eventually the end goal from everybody's standpoint is the same. So we had to create some of these on our own, right, and integrate it with third-party tools, etc. But I think for us, what has given that scale is the platforms.
Great. So I will pick on the word platform today. So my next question will be to start with Garima. So when we are talking about standardization, when we are talking about bringing everything together in some standard form, and we also hear a lot about platform engineering. How do you see the concept of platform engineering along with SRE to work towards that standardization, to work towards that common ground for everybody to work?
Right. This is an excellent point. And I'll start with the current problems or strategic gaps, which everybody here has highlighted with SRE practices. So, SRE practices, tools, platforms to a certain extent are fragmented. It's a fragmented space. There are many tools. Some tools can be scaled, some can handle complexity, some can't. Right. So, that's one thing. So the second aspect of this problem is the strategic gap of not belonging to one governance structure or one framework. So if there are hybrid approaches. You see automation, monitoring, visualization, AI ops, SRE existing, coexisting in the same space, right? And this problems intensifies when you go to scale, right? When you scale your SRE practices, then it will be very, very difficult to bring that array of competence into this dynamics where you have isolated islands, right, of hybrid environments working together. There where platform engineering comes in, and what is expected from the SRE practice. You mentioned it already that we are expecting proactive, actionful insights into the CI/CD pipeline right from the beginning. So SRE practices should shift left, and platform engineering can actually be the enabler to shift those practices left. So that's what I would assume that what would happen is that the core components of SRE practices will be standardized with the flexibility of different flavor of implementation of, let's say, observability or chaos engineering, or bringing your own SLO matrices, budget policies, and so on and so forth. But the ground reality would be that SRE practices would shift left, and that's where platform engineering will come very handy.
Thanks, Garima. So going to Steve, the question here is that today, if you look at the typical organization, you will see that there's an infrastructure team and they are getting all the dashboards and all created from the infrastructure point of view. Others are creating it from the network point of view, some application point of view. Now we are talking about a platform as a service kind of scenario. What can you tell these people that how observability being part of the platform as a service would help and also enable these individual groups, because these groups will not immediately change in one day to become one small organization, right? It will still remain for quite some time. But at this point, how do the observability tool like yours in a platform scenario help them in doing things better, in bringing more reliability?
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it relatively short. I think the first step is just having visibility as like everywhere as you can, because the reality sometimes is sometimes you have black spots or you have areas that you cannot instrument, partly because the system is too hard, or the system is just not easily instrumented, or there's just no telemetry that you can get that out. I think the first thing is just gather everything into one spot if you can. The next step is really spend some time to do some what I call, sometimes people use the word data catalog, like catalog the data nicely into a platform that so that people can understand and extract the right data. I argue that we probably collect way too much data already. It's really not that hard to collect data nowadays. But the problem is correcting the right data and surfacing that at the right time will require some form of combination between business leaders, engineering leads, platform engineers, infrastructure engineers, and all the engineers that's involved to make sure they categorize correctly. It could be as simple as tagging. That's literally simple and right there. And the next step, what I call the $1 million question, is surfacing the right data. That's where every time, where I see a lot of engineers try to figure out what's the best dashboard or the best visualization to do it right there. Usually what we tend to focus is just focus on the business problem and just keep things really, really simple. SLI, SLO, SLA has its merits sometimes, but I really like Harpreet's answer is the best. Sometimes it's just a basic metric that engineer can understand. If that metric the engineer could understand, it really changed the fundamental what can help to do the job. Sometimes that's good enough. You don't really need a really complex SLR and SLO.
Sure. Thanks,
Mm.
Steve. So going to Naresh, the question that I have is, now that we are a point that Steve just mentioned is about bringing in the business with the execution. And that's one thing which I feel is that there is a gap in the two. There is a strategy, there is execution, and then there is no link between the two. Execution goes on its own, strategy stays on its own. What do you see in your scenario? Because you are looking at external customers as well as your internal customers, like the different projects. How do you think SRE can bring in that alignment between the two?
Absolutely. I think goes back to the fundamental question, right? Why are we embracing SRE? While the hype and the Googles of the world are doing this, right, could be a reason. But I think from a business standpoint, right, it's very clearly about the dollars, right? So there is a very clear business outcome out there. And I think once this is known, once this is understood by the leadership, I think, tying it out with the ability to improve resilience, etc., becomes a lot more easier, right? And then it's sort of connected with the brand, it's connected with the loss of business, etc., etc. So I think, frankly, in my view, right, I have seen that amongst a whole lot of different initiatives, this is something that perhaps gets attention very quickly because of the kind of business impact this could have, right, both on the positive side as well as the negative side. So frankly, right, Niladri, my view is that if somebody who is driving this is able to very clearly articulate the value that this can bring, either as a practice or a COE or an initiative or a program, right? I mean, whatever shape and form, different companies would call it different names. But I think when you're starting out at the beginner level, I think, sort of connecting it with the business outcomes is perhaps the most critical thing to do, so that you get the right buy-in, the leadership, sponsorship and support, right, from the leadership. But having said that, I think there are two fundamental things that typically go wrong, right, in the next stages. One, sort of having those quick wins. And I think that's where the choice of applications, the choice of matrices becomes very critical. Which are those apps that you want to actually take up as your first, maybe the first pilots, etc. Right? What are the kind of metrics that you want to actually very clearly touch upon, demonstrate to the leadership that this is how the value is being realized? And the second thing is the awareness, the people aspect, right? The competencies of people. Uh, Very important that we make people aware, we bring in the right level of knowledge, understanding, trainings, etc., right? The enablement that can happen in the initial day. That's very, very critical. So in my view, I think connecting it with the business outcomes, which I think in case of SRE is perhaps much easier than some of the other things that we have done in the past. Second, making sure that we choose the right kind of apps, have the right kind of metrics in the first phase, right, as you're piloting some of this. And second, ensuring that people who are involved have the right level of understanding, right, starting with the leadership in my view, that they understand what this is, have the level of awareness, training, etc., right? And I think from there on, it can sort of grow and scale culturally.
Thanks, Naresh. So my next question will be to both Mandeep and Harpreet, the same question. The question is that now looking at the aspect of the business outcomes and the execution, how do you see should be the path of implementing SRE? Because you people have implemented it in large organizations and are now helping smaller organizations to implement. So, what will be the best way to or best path to take? And also keeping in mind, which I think people lose the context, is that the short-term gains are not really independent of the long-term gain or the long-term vision. These should be the stepping stones for moving to what we want to achieve. And also in terms of, if you can add a little bit about how do you enable the teams, the practitioners to help in this journey of getting into SRE. So I'll start with Mandeep on this and then.
Yeah, yeah, pretty heavy question actually. uh, it my view and then the model that I'm kind of bringing forward is it's based on the use cases. Okay, so what I actually hated about still do about transformation is people trying to find a cookie cutter kind of an approach. Give me a model or give me a framework. Tell me what should I measure. How should I start? Give me top 3 steps or top 5 steps to begin with. Doesn't really work. It can sound fancy, um, but really doesn't help. What really helps is what is it that you are trying to do? What is your use case? What is your context? What is your application? What is your domain? Are you in retail? Are you in banks? Are you in healthcare? Are you in e-commerce, entertainment? What is it? What is it that you're trying to do? What is it that you're trying to solve with SRE? I think that's where I would start. Uh, what is it that you're trying to do with SRE in the first place, right? Is it just another fancy term out there in the market that and you want to put a flag and say, we are also SRE, we're also doing SRE, or is there an actual problem that you think SRE can actually solve for you? So what is your use case? What is your context? Start there. And then involve the right people. I think what Naresh mentioned is, I totally support that. Bringing in the right stakeholders, right decision makers, identifying the quick wins. What are the applications that we should look at first, and then identifying the right measures, right set of metrics. Not just kind of these are the metrics that we do, but what is it that would make sense for this use case? What would make sense for this context? So I think those taught, I think sequentially, right, starting with the use case, the context, involving in the right stakeholders, right people, and then moving into the right metrics and things like that. That would be my approach.
Thanks, Mandeep. Harpreet?
Okay, I'll go next, right? So a few things. I'll probably go back to exactly how I started this call, right? This discussion. What are the outcomes, right? So, and again, going back to what Mandeep said, there are certain outcomes or organizational goals that people need to lay out first, right? Is that improve customer experience? Is it improve time to market? Is it reliability if you're grappling with a lot of issues? And efficiency, because SRE can solve all if done right, right? So what is it that you really are really setting out to do? And over time, the goal should be high, the aspiration should be high, where you can probably achieve all of this and be the next Google or Netflix or whoever who's kind of setting the benchmark for all of this, right? I think that should be an aspiration. Second thing is the willingness to change, right? I think that is crucial because if you are bogged down and see everybody's carrying a lot of legacy. Now, first thing I would say half the battle is won if there's a willingness to change, and then if there are people on the table who are having that mindset shift to move forward. I think that's half the battle won already, right? The third thing would be education. I think people have got to really understand that SRE isn't a silver bullet. There's no such thing as no incidents. Things are going to break, things will break, but how well equipped are you to bounce back from those failures, right? How can you handle that trauma and move forward? I think that's good. Again, the interesting point that Naresh made, pick the right application, pick the right stakeholders. Now, I think these people need to understand that it's a double-edged sword. You go through a transformation, it's not a bed of roses, right? There will be failures along the way, right? Where you try to make a change to improve your architecture, be ready for an incident to deal with, right? It's not everything's going to be a smooth, well-paved road for you to accelerate. So I think that selection identification is crucial, and these people need to be well educated enough, right? To from an SRE point of view, saying that I'm willing to change, I want to go this path, but I'm also ready to handle some issues along the way. But the long-term gains are there to gain, right? I think that's crucial. And then again, how do you measure it, right? I think baselining is very crucial. What are the metrics you're going to look at? Again, going back, if you're doing SLOs, SLIs to start off with, great. Have a proper baseline. Pick your critical services that you want to start. Start thinking beyond systems and start thinking about journeys, right? Because with so much evolution that's happening, no application is an island today. And there's so much evolution. If you look at technology 5-6 years back to where we are today, and again, I'll echo with what Garima said at the start, right? You want to innovate at good pace, you want to bring in new technologies, but you also got to deal with legacy, and all of these are intertwined, right? So how do you actually make all of this work together? So you can't boil the ocean. Pick your critical services, lay out the map, lay out the journey, start small, show short-term success, measure continuously, and strive for those end goals that you really want to achieve. Some could be achieved in parallel, some could be one at a time, but I think that commitment is required. And one last thing where I'll probably end this end this long sermon is psychological safety. I think that becomes very crucial. So for example, if you start doing SLOs, SLIs, for example, what's going to happen is people are going to get exposed. When I say people, systems are going to get exposed. Previously, you'd be measuring them based on a high severity incident. But now you start looking at fine-grained metrics. You say, look at a particular journey, let's say an onboarding journey, and now you're seeing millions of errors happening in a week. And that's going to make people uncomfortable. But the only way is onward and upwards from there, right? So there is that element of psychological safety that's required as well, saying that, it's fine. You're going through this journey. If you're not doing well, I think that's fine, because this wasn't a practice until today, right? So I think that is important. Otherwise, if people are going to be very guarded, chances are they're not going to move too far forward into the journey. So I think these are a few things that I would like to call out, in terms of how SRE as a practice could be implemented and evolved over time within an organization.
Thanks, Apri. I think it's wonderful to hear all of you speaking about it, SRE and implementations and the thoughts. And I like what Steve also mentioned about that. We all agree that what Google has done doesn't mean that we have to copy paste that. And do we really know what they have done? That's also the point. We, as you people said, that we know by what they have published. Like when I was interviewing one of the Google SREs, I got to know that, hey, it's not always the developers who becomes SREs. Actually, they have two different SREs. You have the SE SREs, who are the software engineering SREs, who are experienced in software development, but knows operations. But they also have SA SREs, which are system administration SREs, who has operations experience and knows coding. The two entry paths are having two different bars, but the job is same once they get into it. And it's about the team game, obviously. And as all of you have said, that we have to look at how does it suit our purpose, our objectives, our whys. And that's where we have to come in. And then we have the different tools in order to enable those. So I would like to say that we have a great insight, and I'm sure the participants, the delegates, as of now, we have nearing 9,000 registrations. I'm sure they will get a good insight onto the SRE part of it and would be able to take some of these key takeaways from here and try to implement in their organization. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, all of you, for making this time.
Thank you for the opportunity, Niladri. Great.
Thanks, Niladri. Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
Best wishes on your SRE journey.